Most of you know I'm from the Midwest. And while my family and I love Baltimore and have adopted this city as our own, I also retain great affection for my sweet home, Chicago. If you know anything about Chicago history, you know the Columbian Exposition was critical in putting it on the map. The Chicago Fire of 1871 leveled much of the city, but from the ashes and through Chicagoans' natural chutzpah came a rebuilding effort that led my hometown to become one of the truly great American cities. The World's Fair of 1893 was a critically important turning point. You may know that George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. unveiled his original Chicago Wheel, a gargantuan machine carrying more than 2,000 people at once. Ferris wheels of today pale by comparison. You may also know that great inventions and discoveries were featured, like alternating current, which revolutionized home and industrial lighting. What you may not know is that the Chicago Columbian Exposition played host to a 4-day Jewish Women's Congress, which in turn birthed the National Council of Jewish Women, a grassroots organization whose nearly 200,000 members work for social justice and gender equity, including reproductive rights. Several weeks back, I was asked by members of our congregation to sign on to the NCJW's Rabbis for Repro initiative, which means I've pledged to speak about reproductive rights in my rabbinic capacity. I do so this Shabbat in part because of the current Supreme Court deliberations, the timing of which I believe to be a grave disservice to the American people and to the memory of an American Jewish hero, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But in laying out our tradition's approach to contraception and abortion, I'm not primarily trying to make a political case. I'm trying to remind us as Jews that normative evangelical Christian perspectives on these issues are not de facto religious perspectives. They do not represent us, our contemporary values, nor our traditional and historic beliefs. In fighting for freedom of choice, to worship as we see fit, and for the sanctity of women's bodies, Jews reflect the story of our millennia-old tradition, which, despite its baked-in patriarchy, does not consider the prevention of pregnancy to be a crime, nor the termination of a pregnancy to be murder. So let's start with the Parsha. The first portion of the Torah includes both the advent of and mandate for procreation and the committing and condemnation of the first murder. With regard to the latter, when Cain rises up to slay his brother Abel, the text implies that the impact of this act resounds across time. Vayomer, me asita kol demei achicha tzoakim elai mina adama. Then God said, "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." But the Midrash notices the plural form, demei achicha, your brother's bloods. And Rashi suggests one of two possibilities. Either Cain so wished to murder his brother that, murder being a novel thing in those days, he struck him repeatedly, not knowing just how much it would take. Alternatively, Rashi quotes another Midrashic tradition that the plural of bloods refers to future generations. This is why the Mishnah in Masachet Sanhedrin teaches one who destroys a single life destroys an entire world. Since olam means both world and eternity, the implication is both physical and temporal. To snuff out a life is, after all, to eliminate one's future descendants. So, taking a life is bad. So bad, in fact, that God doesn't repay the crime in kind, even though Jewish law does permit capital punishment. Instead, Cain is forced to wander the earth. A legend has Cain becoming a merchant, worshiping the acquisition of things. His hoarding of material wealth becomes such an obsession that he continues to commit acts of violence to perpetuate his procurement of things. Think of Cain as the world's first mob boss. Eventually, the violence becomes so pervasive that God decides to start over, bringing a flood to wipe out humanity. But Cain scoffs at the idea of preparing for the flood and mocks the righteous man called Noah. The story concludes with a gut-wrenching scene in which Cain's hundreds of children plead with him to let go of his material wealth and seek refuge from the rising tide. But Cain is truly blind to his obsession, so he clamors after more and more until at last he and his wealth are swept away in the deluge. Murder begets the diminishment of human life, begets the deification of things, begets violence, begets self-annihilation. The question is never for Jews about whether life is sacred. The question is, given that life is sacred, how do we ensure lives can be led with dignity and agency? Male lives, female lives, queer and straight lives, white lives, black and brown lives, older and younger lives. The National Council of Jewish Women describes the concept of reproductive justice in this way. Using a broader social justice and human rights lens, it seeks to advance moral and bodily autonomy, health equity, and unfettered access to comprehensive reproductive health care for all communities and individuals. It also emphasizes how multiple systems of discrimination intersect and influence these rights in marginalized communities. Does this framework of a comprehensive approach to reproductive justice, including sometimes curtailing reproduction, represent an authentic Jewish position? What about the very first commandment in Torah? Well, truth be told, it's not clearly a commandment at all. It appears to be a blessing. Nevertheless, right after the first human beings are created, God blesses them and says, Pru urvu mil'u et haaretz, be fruitful and multiply and fill up the earth. Chizkuni, a 13th century French commentator, explains why this verse is included here of all places. Some commentators believe, he writes, that after Adam and his wife had sinned and as a result had been condemned to be mortal, God told them to multiply and thereby to ensure their vicarious survival through their offspring. But, says Chizkuni, the directive or blessing here, long before the expulsion from Eden, is about teaching the purpose of human procreation. The reason it says, it's already written here, he says, is that having offspring is the nearest thing to creating another human being, and this has been the subject at this point. God creates humanity, and then humans created in the divine image are charged with walking in God's ways, yielding more humans. The question, of course, is what does later Jewish law say about procreation? It's true that normative halakha suggests that we are meant to have children. This requirement, interestingly, applies to men, not necessarily to women. But if we're being honest, this is a legitimate reason for a husband to give his wife a get if they're not able to have children. Leaving aside the lack of knowledge about fertility and what causes infertility in classical halakha, two things are important here. First, there is no requirement for the two to get divorced. And second, even when a couple is past childbearing age, or if they're using contraception, they're still encouraged to have a healthy sex life. Sexuality in Jewish tradition is a tool of procreation, but also, crucially, a means of experiencing pleasure, a value in and of itself. So to be clear, family planning is just fine in Jewish law. There may be some dispute about types of contraceptives. The pill would be considered better by some authorities than condoms, but when you factor in both the historical misunderstanding of so-called onanism as being less about spilling seed and more about spitefully denying Onan's wife a child which presumably she very much wanted, and also when you consider the harm caused by sexually transmitted diseases which are better prevented by condoms than other forms of birth control, I would argue that on balance, Jewish law is very much in favor of contraception. In some cases, it may even mandate it. So what about abortion then? I've already made clear we don't believe all heterosexual sex, or even most sex, is meant to bring about life, but also we don't believe life begins at conception. Halakha is clear that life begins at birth. This doesn't mean that all stages of pregnancy are exactly the same. For the first 40 days, the rabbis consider the embryo maya da'alma, which in Aramaic means fluid in its entirety. After that, it's kiyerach imo, which means like the thigh of its mother, which is to say it's not nothing, but it's more like a limb, surely not an independent life. The classic proof text from Torah describes a fight in which two men injure a pregnant woman, causing a miscarriage. Now, this is awful, devastating, of course, and restitution must be paid, but it is not a capital offense. Murder or even manslaughter has not been committed. With regard to terminating a pregnancy itself, the 2nd century Mishnah, Masechet Olot, makes clear, and forgive me for the graphic language, if a woman is having difficulty in giving birth and her life is in danger, one cuts up the fetus within her womb and extracts it limb by limb, because her life takes precedence over that of the fetus. But if the greater part was already born, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. Cain's sin compounds over generations. We've already established that murder is just about the worst thing that we can do with our gift of life. This just isn't that. One may disagree with the choice some other person makes about their body, but it is their body, and what they do with it, short of self-harm or hurting others, is their choice, not ours, surely not the state's. So, the story of reproductive rights in America is not just the story of privacy and the sovereignty of women's bodies. It's also the story of how no religious perspective should determine public policy. Those who are not religious must speak up to insist on their rights to their secular beliefs and practices. But those of us who are religious must also speak up for those who are irreligious, and so that no one religion is treated as dominant, as supreme. No one may force a woman to have an abortion in this country. That's why forced sterilizations on women, like the ones that have allegedly occurred in ICE detention camps, are unconscionable violations of human rights. But the U.S. may not force women who do not wish to give birth to do so, may not force women to get pregnant if they choose not to, nor insist that they make a false choice between abstinence and parenthood. To be Jewish in America is to insist on these freedoms for all. Human life matters. It's paramount. Fetuses are not without some status in Jewish tradition, and abortion should not be taken lightly. But I dare you to find any measurable number of women who have had abortions who take those decisions lightly. The question isn't whether it's a hard choice to make. The question is only who gets to make that choice, to have a child or not to have a child. It's not men, it's not the state, it is women themselves. Shabbat Shalom.